I am Nadine Felber, a Fellow of For Humanity. For Humanity is laying the foundation for an infrastructure of trust with independent audit of AI systems. Independent audit of AI systems can help mitigate risks in AI and autonomous systems. Are you aware of what independent audit of AI systems is? IAAIS is an operational audit framework to provide assurance and mitigate risks from AI and autonomous systems. The components of an audit framework are criteria and certification schemes. What are criteria? Criteria are a set of questions to evaluate if an AI or autonomous system is ethical, unbiased, privacy compliant, secure, and trustworthy. The criteria encompass 5 pillars, namely ethics, bias, privacy, cybersecurity, and trust, helping manage all risks to humans from these systems. What are criteria? Now let's get to the next part. Criteria are a set of questions to evaluate if an AI or the sum of criteria together form a scheme. Unbiased, once a scheme is approved by regulators, it can be used to certify a company's compliance. The criteria encompass 5 pillars, namely ethics, bias, privacy, cybersecurity, and trust. Here is an example, helping manage all risks to humans from these systems. The UK Children's Code expects organizations to consider the best interests of the child while providing online services for children. In this context, a criterion is to verify whether the company's ethics committee examined, considered, deployed, and disclosed risk mitigations to protect the best interests of the child. We are examining whether the ethics officer considered critical aspects. At For Humanity, more than 450 contributors and 37 fellows are crowdsourcing criteria to mitigate risks from AI or autonomous systems. Everything to build an infrastructure of trust for you. Now, let's go deeper about how IAAIS helps build an infrastructure of trust. An infrastructure of trust relies on auditors abiding by 3 rules. For Humanity certified auditors are trained, knowledgeable, objective, and they commit to abide by the Code of Ethics. Second, audits are based on For Humanity criteria and are applied independently and objectively. Finally, audit is done on behalf of people and not on behalf of the companies that pay their fees. You can trust them to work for you because For Humanity auditors abide by the Code of Ethics, which establishes professional responsibility and accountability. IAAIS enables the building of the infrastructure of trust through governance, accountability, and oversight. The key is that each of us has a role to play in protecting humanity with the infrastructure of trust. Join us by contributing to IAAIS to mitigate risks from AI and autonomous systems. Want to know more? Please visit us at forhumanity.center.
Welcome to the ATGO conference. I am going to provide you some guidance regarding the conference platform. Let's get started. Reception tab is your first tab. Reception is a place where you find details about the conference, sessions, speakers, and sponsors. It's like a homepage for all the details regarding the conference. If you schedule meetings with other attendees, you will have them on the reception area. Agenda tab is where you will find details of the sessions, speakers, duration, and time schedule of the sessions. Just note that the time is your local time. Add specific sessions to your calendar to ensure that you don't miss them. At the session, Please ask your questions and respond to polls. Share your perspectives through chat. Event Feed tab is the best place to engage with the community. Share your thoughts and perspectives with the participants here. This will also be a place where you can post photographs, specific quotes, or information you liked in any of the sessions. We are looking to see you posting screenshots, photographs, quotes, etc. It's all about expressing about your interesting experiences at the conference. Attendees tab is the space where you can meet or chat with other attendees. You can learn about people attending the conference and get to know about their work. You will be able to schedule meetings with other attendees and chat with them or exchange contacts for subsequent conversations. It's a place where you have virtual experience of socializing with people. Exchange thoughts, ideas, and engage with your peers and build relationships further. Engage and learn together. Have a great day ahead.
Great. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Mark Potkowitz. I'm a For Humanity Fellow, and I'll be moderating this session. I'd like to begin by thanking For Humanity, our Executive Director, Ryan, also Arzu and Sundar for their tremendous work in organizing this conference, and Jonathan, who's coordinating our session. I'd also like to thank the conference sponsors, MBO partners, Credo AI, Fiddler AI, Babel AI, and the Contellis Group. This session will cover autonomous vehicles, or AVs for short. And if I were to read out all the accomplishments of this tremendous panel that we have and their credentials and accolades, I'm afraid we'd simply run out of time. So I've compiled some short bio sketches, and I'm going to read through each panelist. After I introduce each panelist, I'm going to say a little bit more about the panel and the conference, and then I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves and give some kind of opening statement or say a few words about their interest in autonomous vehicles and some of the work that they've done. So the first person I'm going to introduce is Joan Claybrook. And from 1982 until 2009, Joan was president of the Public Citizen, a nonprofit public interest advocacy organization in Washington, D.C., working hard to improve health and safety of the public, as well as access to a wide range of information and civil resources. Public Citizen works in a wide range of areas, including clean and safe energy, campaign finance, lobbying and ethics reform, accountability and fairness in the marketplace, access to courts, civil rights and civil liberties, and citizen participation. Joan also served as administrator to the U.S. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration when it issued its first ever fuel economy rules, tire safety standards, and airbag regulations. Joan also implemented other reforms, such as the New Car Assessment Program, a groundbreaking consumer information program, which has served as a template for regulators around the world. In addition, she has led several successful efforts to improve vehicle safety, including rollover crash protection, electronic stability control, tire pressure and monitoring systems, and rear view cameras. Joan's also an attorney, a frequent guest on news and media outlets, has authored and co-authored several books and articles on consumer and safety issues, and continues to publish articles in outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. She has received numerous honorary doctorates, awards for consumer advocacy and public service. And I have to say that Joan's work over the years has resulted in saving tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives around the world. So thank you very much, Joan, for participating in this panel.
Thank you.
I'm also thrilled that we're joined by Ed Walters. Ed is the founder and CEO of Fastcase, a legal publishing company based in Washington, D.C. Boasting over 1.1 million subscribers around the world, Fastcase is one of the fastest growing legal publishers in the world. And before founding Fastcase, Ed worked at Covington & Burling in Washington, D.C., and in Brussels, where he advised global firms and organizations like Microsoft, Merck, SmithKline, the Business Software Alliance, the National Football League, the National Hockey League. His practice focused on corporate advisory work for software companies and sports leagues and intellectual property litigation. I'm also super interested in intellectual property, by the way, so I'm looking forward to diving into that with Ed in a few minutes. But while in law school, Ed was an editor of the University of Chicago Law Review and served as the judicial clerk with the Honorable Emilio Garza in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. And for those of you unfamiliar with the U.S. legal system, the United States Courts of Appeal are the federal appellate courts in the U.S. that sit below the U.S. Supreme Court in order of appeal. He's also worked in the White House from 1991 to 1993 in the Office of Media Affairs and in the Office of Presidential Speechwriting. Ed is an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University Law School and Cornell Tech, where he teaches law of autonomous vehicles. He's also the author and editor of Data-Driven Law from Taylor and Francis in 2018, and a contributing author to Legal Informatics, Cambridge 2021. So thank you, Ed, for joining us as well. And finally, we are joined by Dr. Monica Lopez-Gonzalez, a senior lecturer in the Department of Cognitive Science at Johns Hopkins University. And Monica focuses on mapping out of cognitive, behavioral, and neural correlates and how humans seamlessly adapt to a multi-sensory, multi-agent environments. Using an interdisciplinary approach that merges questions, theory, methods, data, and experiences from both the brain and cognitive science and the arts, Monica is identifying the fundamental and nuanced roles of emotion, language, knowledge structures, and cognitive plasticity within real-time improvisatory relating to improvisation and collective problem solving, decision making, and planning behaviors. And her current projects focus on 4 applied domains: human-like automation, such as autonomous vehicles; human behavior modeling, representation and prediction, like cybersecurity; ethics, responsible artificial intelligence governance; and interdisciplinary education, such as science, art, integration. And so thank you, everybody, for joining us on this panel. So what we're going to be doing is discussing a lot of issues around autonomous vehicles from a multidisciplinary approach. And for those of you unfamiliar with autonomous vehicles, which we'll obviously be getting into momentarily, there's a lot of interest globally around the use of autonomous vehicles in a wide range of applications. But a lot of questions arise as to their safety, as to their security, as to their consistency, and as to their reliability. So I think the first autonomous vehicle that I probably saw portrayed was maybe Herbie the Love Bug in film and cinema, where a VW Beetle sort of has a mind of its own and is able to do things. And I think many of us have been taken with the idea of future-looking science fiction films and speculative fiction in which we have this sort of fantasy that we'll be able to get into a vehicle and just say where we want to go and it'll take us somewhere. And a lot of the industry folks emphasize how wonderful these things are, how safe these things are, how efficient they are, how economical they are, how great for the environment they are. But the fact of the matter is, we still have a lot of challenges with respect to making sure that these things are safe, making sure that they are reliable, and making sure that they're good for the environment. So before I continue to go on and on and on about my interest in the subject, I'm going to ask Joan if she could come in and introduce herself to all of the audience members and give us a little bit about her background and her interest in the subject.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm a lawyer. I've been around for a long time. I started my work with the federal government and then in the Congress in the 60s. And I ended up working on auto safety legislation, and I've never left the subject. I worked at the U.S. Department of Transportation when it was first created, the auto safety program was first created, and then under President Jimmy Carter became the administrator of that agency, and had the pleasure really of trying to help frame vehicle safety standards that would save lives, including airbags and other things you've mentioned. And then since then, I was the head of Public Citizen for almost 30 years, working on a wide variety of issues, but never leaving the safety issues behind for cars and trucks and fuel economy. So that's my background with it. I was a tough regulator. I believed in using the authority that I had, and I had many battles with the auto industry over the standards that we proposed and issued. The airbag rule was revoked by Ronald Reagan when he became president. We had to go to the US Supreme Court. We won 9-0, and airbags have now saved over 50,000 lives in the United States, and many, many more worldwide. And the auto industry used to say that safety doesn't sell. Now they admit that it does. And I consider that one of my greatest achievements. So on autonomous cars, these issues started to emerge about 10 years ago or so. And it's clear to me that if they're not safe, they're not going to sell. And if they don't sell, then we don't have autonomous cars. So safety is the real basis for public acceptance of these vehicles. And to date, they haven't been shown to be safe by the auto industry. In fact, what's happened is that the industry, technical companies, and the vehicle companies have attempted to avoid safety standards and to find exemptions in trying to get legislation to exempt them from safety standards. And this has been, for the past 5 years, a really hard-fought battle. Senator John Thune was the major sponsor of this legislation to exempt them. It passed the House unanimously, and it passed through the Senate committee, but luckily it never got enacted into law or passed the Senate overall. So there's really a new day for us to consider, what are we going to do about autonomous cars? And I will speak a little bit later about some of the safety standards that need to be issued in order for these vehicles to be considered safe by the public. This is a public process that the public itself must participate in and has the right to participate in, to make sure that we have broad-ranging and important safety standards from the technical point of view and from the drivability point of view for the American public. So I think that's where I should stop at this moment, and I'll pick it back up talking about specific safety standards a little bit later. I would also say one other thing, and that is that this is an extremely costly issue. The auto industry and the technical companies have put billions and billions of dollars already into autonomous cars. A number of companies have dropped out already from this process because the expense was too much. And so I think they're beginning to understand, which they should have initially, that this is a long-term process. And we're not going to see autonomous cars for a number of years that operate on their own. And the other expense, of course, is going to be in infrastructure, because without infrastructure improvements, you're not going to see autonomous cars able, and trucks as well, able to operate effectively on our public highways. There has to be signage and clarity about the framework of the road, and so that's something no one's made a commitment to, and it's billions and billions and billions of dollars. So we'll come back to some of the safety standards.
Well, Joan, thanks so much. And I'm now going to turn to Ed. If you could introduce yourself and say a few words about your background and interest in the subject.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you guys today. And it's a pleasure to speak with such experienced, interesting co-panelists too. So thank you for that. So I teach a class at Georgetown Law called The Law of Autonomous Vehicles. I teach at Georgetown in the spring and Cornell Law School at Cornell Tech in New York City in the spring, rather, Georgetown in the fall. And the idea of the class is really to see how autonomous vehicles challenge the law. And the kind of macro idea is, how does law deal with things that change very quickly? But autonomous vehicles present some very present challenges to the existing legal framework. Law deals with things that are new all the time, of course, but law does not do a very good job of adapting and changing, at least very quickly, with a world that changes faster than legislators typically do. In autonomous vehicles, powered by Moore's law, the processing speed and the cost of the chips doubling and halving respectively every 2 years will change very, very quickly. And so you have, in many ways, legislators in states and Congress who are typically not experts, not engineers, who are charged with regulating these vehicles. The best we can hope for is experts really in the Department of Transportation, in the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA in the US, to really draft regulations that deal with very fast changing machines. This is true around the world, right? We don't have these philosopher kings who are trained in engineering and who have moral framework and background in which to regulate autonomous vehicles. And so the questions that are posed are really fascinating ones for lawmakers. And my hope is that by studying them directly, studying them in public, we can move up the time frame and have a, as Joan says, a kind of a public framework for regulating autonomous vehicles. What are we talking about? I'm thinking here about some very pragmatic issues, like if an autonomous vehicle speeds and gets a speeding ticket, who should be responsible for that? This is an issue that is very well understood when there is a human being driving the car. What is the appropriate analogy for an automobile that is driving with software? And I think that really goes to the infrastructure of trust. There is a real question about how we should trust machines that make the decisions that people used to. Again, the frameworks have worked out pretty well over the last 130 some odd years for automobiles. I think we've got a pretty good sense of how to hold people responsible for violations of tort law or criminal law behind the wheel of a car. When software is making those decisions instead, how well does that legal regime map onto this new world? And it's actually a relatively hard question. Maybe the last thing I'll say about this is that just because we have an architecture of trust for people who drive automobiles doesn't mean that we should trust people who drive automobiles. Like, at least we understand the rules of engagement when there is a human being behind the wheel. But people are terrible drivers. We are really not very good at operating automobiles, even very safe ones. And so, you'll hear me say this, but people cause fatal crashes at an alarmingly high rate. In some sense, we are sort of numb to it. We don't see it anymore. I don't have the statistics worldwide, but I know, at least in the US, a very small fraction of the driving world, 100 people every day die in automobile crashes. There are something like 3 million car crashes in the US alone every year. NHTSA estimates that something like 94% of crashes can be tied to a human choice or error. So I'm sort of reminded in class all the time of the old joke when two runners encounter a bear on the path, and one of them bends down to tie his shoe, and the second runner says, "You fool, you can't outrun a bear." And the first runner says, "I don't have to outrun the bear, I have to outrun you." It is not the case that autonomous vehicles will be perfect. We have a lot of empirical work to figure out how good of a driver they're going to be. And I think an interesting question is, can they be better drivers than we are? What happens in a future hypothetical world where they are much better than we are on average, but cause an entire class of accidents that people wouldn't? And then, I would love to talk about some of the larger ethical trust issues when software run by a company makes life or death decisions in the field when there's going to be an accident. What is the kind of moral infrastructure that we have in place to deal with traffic accidents that are really determined by private actors?
Well, thanks very much. I think that's a great encapsulation of some of the legal issues that we're struggling with, and moral issues and practical issues around how it is that we assign blame, how is it that we assign fault in a tortious sense. And I apologize to everybody, I'm also a lawyer, so I might get bogged down in looking at some of the legal aspects here, but hopefully we'll all be able to keep each other on track, because I could spend all day talking about the specific fault issues in a tort claim and come up with all sorts of scenarios about what might happen. But before I do that, I'd like to reintroduce Monica and ask her to come in and say a few words about her background and her interest in the subject.
Yeah, so in hearing both John and Ed, I really therefore come here in a complimentary way, because I come to the autonomous vehicle space first and foremost as a cognitive brain scientist. And for several years now, I have been becoming, and I really more so, quite a lot now, as an advisor to a range of organizations and stakeholders through my organization, the Institute for Human Intelligence, for which I'm the co-founder and the CEO. And the point of this is that I'm here to integrate a human-centered approach to the development of autonomous vehicles, but also more broadly, autonomous systems at large. So I've mentioned two key concepts here, that of being a cognitive scientist and the use of a human-centered perspective. And that's what I'd like to define right now. So in regards to being a cognitive scientist, I've always been interested in understanding what makes our human intelligence so unique as a species. And as a result, my research work in industry through my company for many years now has focused on identifying the various elements that include emotion, cultural constructs, language, really that are integral to our capacity to so efficiently and seamlessly adapt to ever-changing environments. And so for me, this becomes a critical component to the building of intelligent systems, because if we want a genuine interaction between humans and machines, and by that I mean a 24/7 back and forth relationship, which is what we're at right now, these systems need to have a level of intelligence that is, if not the same as ours, but of equivalent capacity in order to fit into our human world. So that now brings me to the second concept, which is a human-centered approach. So what I mean here is that I have always considered the development and advancement of artificial computational systems as not just inputs and outputs of numbers, but of inputs and outputs and their many contextual factors that are not necessarily reducible to numbers. So this should be an obvious point, but unfortunately it has not been the case, and it is not within the engineering world, and it has not been either in industry or in academia. And this is where the autonomous vehicle space, whether we're talking about fleets of robo-taxis or at the individual consumer ownership level, where we have this fundamental area in which we need to adopt a social technical perspective in their design, in their development, and in their deployment, because our world is not a single steady state box, right? It's a complex, multi-sensory, dynamic environment. And we humans are an ideal model from an intelligence perspective, from which to gain insights into how systems can efficiently interact with each other and successfully adapt. And so I'm essentially coming from the perspective that this human-centered approach is one that can actually lead to safer and more sustainable artificial intelligence systems if we apply insights from human behavior within the entire AI lifecycle. Because let's face it, we're not disappearing anytime soon, right? And in fact, our world is becoming ever more complex as climate change and global networks and digital infrastructure all intersect now and drastically change our human behaviors. So we cannot simply ignore that fact. And so that's why I really believe that the problems we have with autonomous systems, and right now with autonomous vehicles, is that the human was not considered as part of the design in the first place. And so that's certainly has entire consequences for what we mean for trust, for ethics, for explainability and transparency that I will definitely go in more detail in a bit.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really excited to dive into this because I think that we're going to cover a lot of ground in the time that we have. And unfortunately, we only have an hour left in the panel, and I wish we had all day to dive into these things because there are just so many things that we can really dive into that I'm really excited. So the first question I'm going to ask as the moderator is to Joan. One of the things that you brought up, Joan, when you were talking about your kind of regulatory battles in the past and some of the issues with safety, is that these things aren't necessarily at a point in time where they in fact are safe yet. However, we've had in the past people make predictions as to when we would all be riding around in autonomous vehicles. So for instance, in 2015, Elon Musk had predicted that we were 2 years away at that time from have fully functioning autonomous vehicles that we'd be riding around in. And you'd recently written a letter to the editor of the New York Times, and you suggested a few things that you think that auto manufacturers should be focusing on now for what I'll call traditional, traditional vehicles, but obviously that these would have implications for autonomous vehicles as well. So could you tell us a little bit more about sort of some of the current safety issues as you see and what you would like to see brought over into the world of AVs for us to have more confidence in their safety?
Well, first, I'd like to say that what powered the auto and tech companies to rush into this is that they didn't want to be lost in the process. They wanted to be at the forefront. And so they made all sorts of boasts and predictions that they could do this very quickly, including, of course, Musk. The real way to approach this issue, in my view, is to take some of the ingenious things that have been done in what I call the pre-crash area, that is the driving area of vehicles. Airbags are in the crash worthiness side, where they automatically protect you when you have a crash. But more recently things have been developed that are very, very exciting, which are in the pre-crash or the crash prevention area. And they're already on some vehicles. And these should be put on all vehicles. There should be federal standards that require their minimum performance for them. And the public should be better informed. And right now they're just on the upscale cars. So they're not standard across the market. And a lot of the public don't even know anything about them. But those who have the higher end cars do. And what I'm talking about there is something that have been named forward collision warning, plus the auto brake, a lane departure warning, a blind spot detection, rear automatic braking, rear view cameras, and forward collision warning. These are very effective systems. And I can't say that in every single car they are, because there's no federal standard that says they have to meet a minimum performance requirement. But this, to me, is the way to introduce the concept of autonomous vehicles to the public. That is, gradually, with things that the public really cares about. And they have an extremely high payoff. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, which is quite renowned for its research in this area, has shown that for example, if you have a forward collision warning plus an automatic brake, that you'll have a 50% reduction in front to rear crashes. And one of the things that is an enigma to the driving environment right now has been distracted driving. And of course, also the issue of drunk driving, tired driving, truck drivers and regular drivers who are extremely tired. And if you have these systems built in that alert the driver and also protect not only the driver, but people in other vehicles automatically, you're going to have a vast reduction in the number of crashes. And if you have a vast reduction in the number of crashes, then you're going to have life-saving as well as financial savings that are going to make a huge difference. And that is going to be very attractive to vehicle drivers because it's going to be, we might say, partially autonomous. So that's the way I think this ought to be initiated and introduced to the public. And I think that the U.S. Department of Transportation National Highway Traffic Safety Administration ought to issue standards very rapidly now for these systems, because they are already been designed. We know how they work, and that makes it much easier to write a safety standard if you have systems that are already on cars and are doing well and have high payoff. And I've worked on a lot of trying to get a lot of these to promote a lot of these issues, and particularly some like rear view cameras. We got a law passed that required a standard to be issued, and when they didn't issue the standard, we sued and we got the standard issued. So this is very exciting. But I think that for the future, for autonomous cars of the future, we really do need a large number of safety standards that the industry right now is opposed to. They want to have exemptions from these standards. My view is that we should have a large number of them, and I'm going to give you just a few examples of them. One is a vision test for autonomous vehicles. That is just the way the public is tested for its vision capability. There should be a vision test for the vehicle itself. The human machine interface for driver engagement that is adequate to get the attention of the driver to assume the dynamic task in an emergency. Cybersecurity standard, a huge issue of cybersecurity to prevent hacking and ensure a mitigation and remediation of such events. And that's going to be an increasing problem. Electronics and software safety standards, which now do not exist, even though we have a lot of electronics in cars. An operational design domain, a functional safety standard to ensure the design, development, and verification, validation of safety-related electronics and software. And then, of course, a fallback standard should the driver have to suddenly take over if there's a malfunction in the autonomous system. And a crash procedures standards requiring that the manufacturers, when the AV is involved in a crash, to assure the safety of all the occupants and road users. Also safety and performance data is essential, development of it. So when there's a crash, there's data that is produced. You have to have privacy issues involved there, but it's very, very important to have such data. And I'm very pleased that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration just about 3 weeks ago issued a mandate to the manufacturers of any autonomous or partially autonomous vehicle that they have to report every crash in those vehicles to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So it will have data which will allow it then to develop these safety standards, and they can't do it without that. Of course, there also needs to be requirements for over-the-air updates, which I know Tesla has to some extent. I don't know how perfect they are, but they do have them. And so anyway, these are the kinds of things that need to be required. What the auto industry and the tech industry want to do is to exempt these vehicles from standards so that they can more rapidly produce and not worry about the minimum standards from the Department of Transportation. So I feel that that is really an essential for the future of these systems. And just see if there's something else I want. Oh, well, yeah, I think that without these standards, the public is not going to buy these vehicles. And the other last point, I guess, that's really important to make is that the standards issued by the Department of Transportation are performance standards, safety performance standards. They're not design standards. They don't tell the manufacturer how to design a vehicle. They set performance criteria, and then the manufacturer has to, with its own designs, make sure that they meet those criteria. So this is what's essential for the future.
Oh, thanks very, excuse me, thanks very much, Joan. And I think it's really interesting how you pointed out that there are a lot of safety features that are sort of post-crash safety features, deploying airbags, crumple zones in cars, things of that sort. And that one of the interesting components that the autonomous vehicles and semi-autonomous vehicles can address is this issue of pre-crash safety standards, or preventative measures and sensors they can do to prevent the crash from happening in the first place. And I know that we're very focused on crashes, and we mentioned them several times because those are one of the biggest risks associated with vehicles. To comment on what Ed was saying earlier, I think the latest statistics I was able to see were from the World Health Organization that says in 2016, I think 1.35 million people globally died in automobile crashes. And despite the increasing safety standards we have globally, that number seems to be increasing proportionally to the population on an annual basis. So even though we have better technology and we have better safety standards, it seems that the rate at which people crash per capita isn't really changing. So Ed, I'd like to turn to you, because I know one of the issues we discussed earlier was liability and fault. And if there is an AV crash, how do we find out who's responsible? If an AV does speed, as you mentioned, to whom do we send the speeding ticket? And I'm just thinking that I think it was in April or March of 2018, there was an AV crash in which somebody was killed, a pedestrian in Arizona. And recently there was a crash in which somebody using the autopilot feature on a Tesla, which they shouldn't have been using because they didn't seem to actually have been behind the wheel. From all reports, it seems that somebody was in the back seat and somebody was in the passenger seat. So, when these things sort of happen, how do we assign fault or blame? And would somebody go after the manufacturer here, or would you kind of go after the person who's the operator or the driver? What would that look like from a legal perspective?
Yeah, great question. So maybe I can take a piece of what Joan said and tee up something for Monica in like just a minute, and just say that if you look at the history of automobile safety and of human fatalities in car crashes, the trend has been, I think, certainly following Joan's tenure in the Department of Transportation, but even maybe before that, the trend has been safer and safer cars with fewer and fewer fatalities every year. People are still in crashes, but they survive them much better because of things like seatbelts, anti-lock brakes, airbags, and the governments around the world have mandated that cars be safer and safer every year. In the US, using the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, but using comparable regulations around the world, cars have gotten safer. Fewer people have died every year on a percentage basis until about 2016 or 2017, right? In 2016 and 2017, that progress stalled out. In 2018 and 2019, the number of people who were killed in accidents actually increased, to Mark's point. And part of the reason is that there are two systems in cars that are really contributing to this, that are really failing. One of them is this, the availability of mobile devices inside of cars. The other is this. The interaction of these two things is extremely dangerous in the automobile context. And so at the end of a 50-year period where we've gotten much, much better at making cars safer, suddenly we have taken pretty safe cars and made them less safe all of a sudden, right at the dawn of this era of new autonomous features in cars. Okay, so I'll tee that up for Monica later, because the person-machine interface inside of cars in some ways is breaking with distracted driving. Okay, point two, I think we should think about autonomous vehicles not as like a binary. Like some cars are not autonomous and some cars are. As Joan points out, we have handed over parts of the driving experience to software on a continuum for years. When you slam on the brakes in most modern cars, the brakes are anti-lock brakes that will pulse according to software and sensors. In some sense, this is like self-braking brakes. I don't know. It's so we shouldn't think of self-driving cars as like either they are or they aren't. Most people think about these things according to a spectrum, and you'll have different kinds of regulation depending on what features of cars are already autonomous and which ones aren't. But I think it's just important to realize that the sort of, if you take the Society of Automotive Engineers rating, they will say that they go on a continuum from like level 0 to level 5. Level 5 cars are the most autonomous, right? And so these level 5 cars can do everything that human beings can under every circumstance or operational domain. As Joan said, level 0 cars are like a classic car that doesn't even have anti-lock brakes. So we should be thinking about these cars as not either autonomous or not, but in varying degrees of autonomy. In some senses right now, the most autonomous cars are probably like level 3 autonomy. They can't do everything. They can't do everything under every circumstance. There are some kind of notorious ways in which these things fail. I think one of my most illustrative but tragic examples is a case where someone was driving a Tesla using autopilot, and a white box truck on a kind of a gray overcast day pulls in the road in front of him. Tesla doesn't use LiDAR, it uses cameras, and the camera was able to distinguish the white box truck from the wide open sky. And effectively didn't see the truck at all and drove headlong into the truck without even braking. So it's we're using software to make decisions that humans used to in a really imperfect way. The other thing I'd like to talk about here is that there will be places where machines are much better than people at driving cars. They don't get tired, they don't get stupid, they don't get drunk, they don't get distracted. Machines won't suffer any of those problems that people do. Machines process things today faster than we do. They can use more sensors than we do. And I think it's safe to say that new autonomous vehicles will permit driving in a ways that humans can't. Imagine for a second autonomous vehicles being able to deploy airbags before the collision, right? Instead of using a sensor in the bumper that says a collision has happened, immediately as fast as you can deploy airbags, it might say there's a 92% chance of a collision in the next 3 seconds, deploy airbags outside the car. We can't process much more in operating a car than a wheel and 2, maybe 3 pedals on the floor, gas, brake, steer. But you can imagine software that operates each wheel of the car independently. You could imagine software that understands how safely to turn a wheel 90 degrees. So instead of just turn left, turn right, brake, like autonomous vehicles might have the ability to spin or ricochet or create a collision that is much less dangerous to the human occupants, using software in ways that people couldn't. So it's interesting, this might be teeing up Monica as well, but right now we're sort of thinking of autonomous vehicles as performing the exact same operations that people do in cars as a way to avoid casualties or make things safer or more convenient. In the future, we'll have ways that autonomous vehicles can drive cars that people can't. You might have to dumb down the vehicle to allow a human driver to take the wheel in some sense, and not permit some things that an autonomous vehicle can do that people can't or won't or shouldn't. So I think those things are all really interesting. We will have this large time between level 3 autonomy now and level 5 autonomy later, where the issues are a giant mess. You will have cases where autonomous vehicles are less safe than human drivers, except in certain circumstances. You'll have cases where people take the wheel inappropriately from autonomous vehicles and cause accidents. You'll have cases where there's almost like a herd immunity effect, where human drivers will be less safe because there are autonomous vehicles on the road with them. And then later, autonomous vehicles will be less safe because there are human drivers on the road with them. It will not be like a binary there either, where one day we wake up and every car on the road is autonomous. We'll have a long period where people continue to drive less safe cars or more safe cars alongside autonomous vehicles. In 2011, IBM did a demo project of Watson. It played Jeopardy against the two best human players in history, Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter. No one really thought Watson was going to win the first time out of the box, but it did, and did like spectacularly. Watson crushed the human competitors in that game of Jeopardy. But I'm fascinated by something that happened in Final Jeopardy. So the question in Final Jeopardy, where Watson was playing Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter, the category was US cities in the United States. The clue was its largest airport is named for a World War II hero. Its second for a World War II battle. Okay, so in the category of US cities, Brad Rutter and Ken Jennings both guessed Chicago, which was correct. Watson said, "What is Toronto?" And people were baffled by this. How could this machine that is dominating this game of Jeopardy miss something that's seemingly so simple, right? Like kids Jeopardy players wouldn't guess Toronto in the category of US cities. Well, the fact is that when Watson is playing Jeopardy and when machines are driving cars, they're constantly trying to observe the world and make hypotheses about what's going on. Watson's trying to guess what the question is and forms a hypothesis about, sort of what's being asked, and then has like kind of a confidence score about how well it understands the answer. In this case, it didn't have a very good sense at all of what was being asked. But so I'm fascinated by this question. In a world where autonomous vehicles, generally speaking, are safer than human drivers. Let's imagine, a world where something like half of the accidents that are caused by humans could be avoided by autonomous vehicles. But autonomous vehicles in that same world create an extra number of crashes that humans don't. Let's call these Toronto errors, where the car guesses Toronto and makes a mistake that humans would not. I think I can share this with you guys. So this is maybe like a little map of what that might look like, right? So in a world where human drivers in the US maybe would cause 36,000 deaths over the course of a year, 100 per day, roughly. You can expand this to Mark's statistics of 1.3 million deaths per year annually. And then imagine, and Joan, I might be teeing you up a little bit here too. Imagine hypothetically that autonomous vehicles will cause a smaller number of accidents, maybe something like a third, right? So 13,000 deaths per year instead of 36,000 deaths. In some sense, this is amazing, right? I mean, we are literally saving 23,000 lives per year in my hypothetical, not an empirical claim. But there will be, in my hypothetical, 3,000 deaths that humans would avoid, and obviously avoid, right? The car will pull into a divider, will hit the white box truck in a way that people would not, right? And so I think it's a very interesting question from a torts perspective. If AVs are overall safer, should there be special responsibility for the 3,000 deaths that they cause that people would not? A different way of thinking about this is, what should the torts rule of reasonability be in an autonomous vehicle context? Should we require them to be driving with a reasonable person standard, in which case you might have extra responsibility for those 3,000 deaths because a reasonable person would not cause those deaths? Or should it be a reasonable AV standard? Should we require them to be reasonable compared to other autonomous vehicles? In which case, you might say that most autonomous vehicles would create these 3,000 deaths, or would create some very small subset of them and ask a different question altogether. Going up at least a level of generality here, the question for torts is who is responsible and who is responsible for what? In the human-driven car example, it's pretty clear who is responsible, right? If a human driver makes a mistake or acts negligently, the human driver is responsible. In the autonomous vehicle context, the cast of characters is much larger, right? You have a person who owns the vehicle. You might have a totally different person in the vehicle, a grandmother, a kid, a dog on the way to the veterinarian, right? You have a vehicle manufacturer, maybe Chrysler or Toyota or Daimler Chrysler or Tesla. And then in some cases, you might have a totally different company that makes the software that drives it, like Waymo or Uber or someone else. And so what is pretty well understood, I think, in the human driving context becomes vastly more complex in the torts context. Is it right to say that the human owner of the vehicle should be responsible under any circumstance? And most torts professors would say no, because they can't do anything to avoid the accident. They might not even be in the car. On the other hand, if you hold manufacturers responsible, that might push out by 10, 15 years the rollout and adoption of autonomous vehicles. We could postpone in some very dangerous way the saving of tens of thousands of lives, millions of lives around the world, because we're holding them to a higher standard. So I don't have a dog in this fight, but I will say that the issues are very complex, and we don't have an extremely good framework for answering those today. Maybe my last point is just a criminal law question. There are some very good criminal law theorists, Professor Hubbard among them, who say in most criminal law jurisdictions, there's no requirement of who the actor is, right? And so there's nothing that says that autonomous vehicles or autonomous vehicle manufacturers can't be responsible for violations of criminal law. That may sound kind of wonky. If I say I'm taking the driver out of the car and the owner of the car might not be responsible, but the car itself might be responsible, or Waymo might be responsible for violations of the speed limit. I'll just point out that in most jurisdictions in the world, there is a concept of this sort of artificial person being responsible for violation of criminal law. In the US, corporations are considered to be artificial persons of law. They can sign contracts, they can be held responsible, both for torts and for criminal law violations. And if you read most statutes, it doesn't say a human driver is responsible for driving faster than the posted speed limit. It just says there will be a penalty for driving faster than the speed limit. And so we could conceptualize a world where an autonomous vehicle manufacturer is the least cost avoider for torts, is the appropriate responsible party for violations of criminal law, because they indeed are the ones who can avoid these kinds of harms or these kinds of behaviors. And in fact, people in some sense aren't really able to avoid it. If you're driving an autonomous car, you can't change the software to make sure that it doesn't speed through a school zone. And so I'll just say that the difficulty of applying the law of torts of criminal law in an AV context, vastly unfigured out.
And one of the things that happened in the very beginning of autonomous car discussions was the manufacturer said, well, they would be responsible for any problems. They haven't been saying that for about 10 years now.
Right.
They suddenly realized what they were committing to. I would just say that the deficiency that I see in your analysis is the presumption that all 36,000 deaths, excuse me, are caused by some driver. And that's just not true. If you analyze these crashes, that's just not accurate. And I won't go into all the particulars of that. But anyway, I like the way you do it, sort of in a general way. But I think that your evaluation, but it's not a one-to-one comparison to the car versus the consumer.
No, I totally agree. And if you sort of see,
I want to add something there. I want to add something to Joan's, to sort of piggyback off of Joan's point here. I mean, we know that when in terms of, you look at the crash reports, there are many types of side swiping and fender benders in which the semi-autonomous vehicle hits the human. So from behind or from the side. And coming from the scientific perspective, the reason why this is happening is because human beings have an expectation about other drivers. That expectation from a cognitive standpoint does not exist in the driverless, in the semi-autonomous or the autonomous vehicle. So we're talking here about different types of intelligences. And just sort of to narrow down, focus back the point that Ed was making, really from the science side and the industry and what we're making perspective, is that we really need to make that distinction between narrow intelligence versus general intelligence. Narrow intelligence, all of whether it's driverless cars or really any other type of intelligent autonomous computer system, is built to do X and that's it, or X, Y, and Z to the max. We human beings have this capacity to transfer our knowledge and our abilities into a multiplicity of tasks and environments. So the minute you mix the different types of intelligences, we're going to enter into problems. And that is to the point that, yes, we have the levels from 0 to 5, the so-called no automation at all the way to full automation. And the problem becomes that when we start mixing all of these different levels at the same time, that's where we get this crossover, this mismatch of intelligences, if you will. Now, granted, right now, if all the roads were to allow fleets of robo-taxis, the technology already exists to happen. But that's the problem. We don't have even the infrastructure, the traffic infrastructure, to create those differentiated worlds of robots, complete autonomous robots versus humans. And that's to my point where we really need to consider, when we come to the question of safety, what these criteria are has to be really the answer boiled. It's a scientific question. And that's really where the problem lies, because we as scientists, as engineers, as industry makers, we need to first realize that we're not putting these systems out there on their own. They're here to be engaging with us, human beings, 1. 2, once everybody accepts that fact, then we need to say, okay, what are the problems we currently have in the development of machine learning, to realize that those perception systems, those that we currently have today, do not work at the same level that we human beings perceive the world. So that's the second. The third becomes, okay, so now that we realize that and we've accepted it, let's figure out exactly what are the methods we need to now revolutionize, frankly, within the machine learning R&D world. Once we get that, we also need to be therefore in communication with the regulators and the policymakers to say, look, this is a dynamic process. So we're not going to get there tomorrow or in 2025 or even in 2040. Maybe we won't get to until the end of the century. Maybe that's a next century problem. And any types of criteria or standards that need to be created now need to take into account that variability and that dynamic nature of where we are scientifically, along with what is currently available on the roadways. And I know I want to, and I think this might be a great segue into trust. I know this was a topic that we had spoke about previously with Mark, in terms of what does this mean for trust coming from the regulators' perspective, from the consumer's perspective, and from the R&D perspective. And I do want to mention that that is the question, right? Everybody's asking, what is trust? And why are we even talking about it? So I do want to mention, and this is coming now more from the socio-cultural anthropological perspective, but trust is really, it's a vital social process that helps us to cooperate with others and to form a relationship, right? And if you think about it, it's actually inherently risky. Why? Because of the unpredictability of others' intentions. But despite that unpredictability, we actually learn to accept vulnerability and depend on one another to produce positive mutual advantages. And crucially, the success of this dependency relies on the reciprocity and the gains that are perceived from such. So let's take an example here in the context of assured autonomy. Suppose company A offers me an AI-enabled autonomous system that has X, Y, and Z characteristics. I, as a consumer, I believe in the integrity of the company for whatever reason, maybe because I already know them, I've already bought products from them, I see their marketing and branding and so forth. So I buy the offered system because precisely I'm going to expect X, Y, and Z are true features. So there's the performance issue that has already come up in the discussion. So inherent in this business transaction is my confidence in company A providing me with the claimed system's performance capability. Okay, so far so good, right? What happens when problems arise? When the system does not perform as intended and explainability of the failure is left unanswered. So that lack of explainability suggests a shortfall in company A's standards of ethical behavior and accountability. And so my trust now in the company is going to diminish. So this is what we could probably put this under the concept of truth within advertising, right? So part of this concept of trust is the issue of explainability or transparency. And if you're in the field and looking up what that means, explainability and transparency seem to be used synonymously. I'm not sure they're actually the same. In fact, the reason why I say I'm not sure is because literally we all disagree with that. And so what makes explainability or transparency such a complex R&D question is that we, across industry and across academic research labs, we do not have a single agreed upon definition of what even explainability or transparency means. Does it refer to the overall system or model? Does it refer to the system's components, like the model parameters, the inputs, the computations? Or does it refer to the system's training algorithm? So from an R&D perspective, we really have a mess of concepts and their algorithmic implementation. Now, from the perspective of the regulators, well, I can already imagine me putting myself in their shoes. I'm like, wow, we have an even more chaotic situation because what am I even supposed to be looking for if I'm going to come in to audit something? What am I looking for? Do I have to look at all these? Do I have to entertain all of these definitions and start going through almost like a search problem space here, working with a company to do that? And then we know, of course, from the legal side, I mean, a lot of these algorithms this is intellectual property. So is that even available to be shown out to who these regulators are? It's all over the place. And then if we think about the consumer, unfortunately, let's be honest, they don't really care. And part of it is, and well, actually, that's a whole nother question of education, and that's a whole nother topic we could talk about. But they don't care because they are simply assuming, trusting that the system is going to perform as expected. So if you tell me it's automated, that means it runs on itself. It goes by itself. I don't have to be part of even knowing how the system works or why it works. So, and we do know from the research, the proof that people actually trust companies' products before they even know whether they're safe or not is just think about what has happened with the use of Facebook. What has happened with the use of multiple types of AI technologies. They go out to market, people immediately engage with it, the consumer demand rises, more and more people keep buying it, we get overly ecstatic advertising campaigns, and then the problems start happening and people are like, oh, wait a minute, oh, now my rights have been violated. Well, see, that's the problem. We have not only, so that goes back to the issue I brought earlier about the social technical problem that was not considered from day one. It was not considered from day one from the engineering perspective, from the scientific perspective. It was not considered from the industry perspective, not even considered from the public general public perspective. And so now we're trying to sort of reverse engineer the problem, despite the fact that the scientific advancement has proliferated and we're moving much faster. And yes, the law always ends up being behind with dealing with the scientific advancement. And I think that actually we could be all at a predictive level if we had all had these communications, these conversations from day one.
I'd just like to say one thing that reinforces what you say, and that is that the most dangerous period of time on the highway is when you have a mix of new autonomous vehicles and the existing vehicles. And the public is not going to be prepared for them. That's why I say this process must be very gradual. It must come in a very gradual way with a major educational program and effort and government regulation that sets forth the existing autonomous vehicle advantages that I've mentioned of automatic braking and so on, and an education of the people who are not knowledgeable about AI and autonomous vehicles. That's going to be, if you're going to see an increase in safety, an increase in crashes and dangers, that's going to be the period of time, and that we're totally unprepared for at this moment.
Which means we need a major upskilling of the entire, we're talking, I mean, here in the United States and nationally, but globally, we need a major upskilling of the entire human society to understand this if we want to, because that's part of the safety question. That's part of the trust question, frankly.
Right.
Well, when you were speaking about this, I was thinking, as an American, I now live in the United Kingdom. And my expectation as to where cars are coming from isn't correct because they drive on the opposite side here to which I'm accustomed. So I still routinely, even though I've been here just over 2 years, look the wrong direction when I'm crossing the street, because for over 35 years, I was looking in the other direction when crossing the street. And that's just instinctual to me at this stage. And so at this point, I had some other questions, but I think the conversation is going in a very fascinating direction. So I just kind of like to open things up and allow this discussion to continue. I was going to ask Joan about this, what this regulatory process might look like, presuming we're able to get to a point of explainability, but you've already touched on public education. So if I could kind of steer things in that direction a little bit as to how it is that you think this process would look like, of regulators and lawmakers and maybe industry coming together to try to find out and set these standards that you've brought up, Monica, as to what explainability means, what transparency means, and what these educational components could look like. So I'm going to kind of step back and let the conversation carry on from here, because I'm really fascinated to hear what you all come up with.
Well, I'd just like to say that from the federal government's point of view, there is no capacity right now in the Department of Transportation to handle any of this. That agency has been starved. Its budget has been drastically cut. There are virtually no experts on AI in the U.S. Department of Transportation. And so I see this as a real problem that that no one has acknowledged. And the Congress has just gone crazy doing some really important legislation, funding things that are essential for this country, but ignored have been the technological changes that are happening right now, and we have wild Indians like Musk, doing their own thing and claiming that that his vehicles are not a problem when they go around and they hit emergency vehicles and cause an investigation at the Department of Transportation. But there's no capacity really at USDOT to handle any of this. And so I see that as a major issue, that there need to be congressional hearings. And there's a new, very talented deputy administrator at the agency who, Steve Schiff, who is going to have to address these issues soon, because otherwise, we can theorize all we want, but on the highway, it's going to get worse and worse as there's a greater mix of these different types of vehicles.
So Ed, do you see the industry? Oh, sorry, Monica, please.
Well, no, I was going to say that one of the answers with, and this is actually a topic that had come up in a previous conversation we had, this I think is a great moment to enter into what industry is doing in terms of addressing the problem from the human in the loop versus human outside of the loop issue. And I want to bring it up because that becomes fundamental to this trust topic, and it becomes fundamental to what the conversation should be, I think, between industry and regulators. So to clarify for those outside in the audience here, what human in the loop refers to, it's basically a computational model that requires the interaction of the human and the machine. So in simple terms, what it's saying is that the human has a degree of control over starting or stopping any action that's performed by the intelligence system after receiving a specific cue. Now, the reason why this is important to trust is because in order for this human-machine interaction to run smoothly and be successful, the bells and whistles, if you will, are implemented within the system that provide the cue to the human to take over need to conform to the various nuances and idiosyncrasies of human perception and cognition. And that goes straight to Mark's point of having learned to drive on one side of the road versus another road, being in a different country, different system. Now and so let's take just a really specific example with AVs. So we know that when automated driving fails, right, or it's limited to some extent, the autonomous mode disengages. And so what's the expectation there? Well, the driver is expected to resume the actual manual driving. The problem with that is that if the driver does not understand the processes of the system, so there goes the point about education. If the driver has not been trained on the meaning of the cues that are programmed to become salient during the disengagement and the necessary steps to follow through, and on top of that, the driver expects the system to perform correctly. So here's where we have the trust issue. The transition from sitting passively to suddenly taking over the wheel actively has to happen in an appropriate and timely manner. And this is a huge problem between the system disengagement issue, accidents, and human attention and reaction times. Now, how is this different from human outside of the loop or human on the loop? So this is a term that's actually, it's been gaining more speed, in fact, and I've seen it more in the military context now, really around automated detection systems for missiles and air-based attacks. But it's really just as old as the human in the loop concept, because it's the big question within automation as to how much should humans have a role within the processes of the system. So what it underscores here in the debate is about whether humans should be moved even further away from the decision-making loop to the point of being completely taken outside of it. And the idea is that, okay, humans still have to have oversight of the system, but we would no longer have a role within the decision-making processes as it's happening in real time. And the reasoning behind that is that the decision-making becomes faster and potentially even more powerful simply because humans don't need to approve anything, don't need to enter in and manipulate something within the system. They don't have to manually change the function. So the whole human in the loop versus human outside of the loop question, it's really one of control. How much should we humans have or not have in terms of controlling the system? And that is what the scientific, the R&D, the industry world is working on. So that's the tension, right? Because it's like, well, if we're the ones who are making these products, we have to decide for society in a way, and this is an ethical, political, philosophical question, normative question. Do we decide for society what we should do? And we know, and the research shows that if you look at different societies, different cultures, everyone has a different moral standard of who or what should have control. So since yes, the government has been behind this, the regulatory field framework has been behind what industry has been attempting to do. And I'm not saying it's perfect, it's actually a mess, it's chaotic. But from the scientific perspective, it's a real R&D problem. So the question now becomes, how do we come to a middle ground where we realize and accept the rising legal challenges that are coming up about explainability, about trust, transparency, and so forth, and ethics, with the innovation that's necessary scientifically that needs to be done to actually make these systems possible?
Well, I wish that we had another hour and a half to go through these issues. Unfortunately, our panel is beginning to run out of time. So I'm sorry, I haven't really been able to get to audience questions. I had a few more questions I was hoping to discuss with everybody, and maybe sometime soon we can reconvene to pick these issues up. I've been taking notes. We've recorded the session so that we can review it and come back to some of these things. But I want to make sure that everybody on the panel has time to kind of give some closing thoughts or takeaways from this discussion, and what you would encourage people who are watching this to either look into more or to have a takeaway from. So Joan, I'd like to go to you first for some closing thoughts.
Well, my concern is that no one is really doing any planning in the government at this point. And the industry is going to move on in its own direction and do its own thing, and look at its profitability in relation to these issues. I feel like it's really the public are guinea pigs essentially at this point. And they really don't know and understand what's happening. They know a little bit, but not much. So I think there needs to be a major effort in government to evaluate all the things that we've discussed today, and to set some benchmarks and where we should be attempting to move with better transparency and openness between government and industry in these areas.
Thanks very much. Ed?
I think maybe I'd like to close with a note about trust, the topic of our conference in some sense, in our panel. We are in a crisis of trust right now in the autonomous vehicle world. And part of that crisis has been driven by companies that are over-promising what their autonomous vehicle features can do. My classic example of this is Tesla branding its vehicles as FSD, or fully self-driving, when they are nothing of the sort. And people wanting to believe that cars can do everything that people can do in every operational domain today, when they clearly can't. And so we had, like all of AVs, have to be built on an architecture of trust. And we are critically undermining that trust today on both sides of the transaction, in companies that are overselling what cars can do, and people who are kind of willingly, blindly believing in that. And in many cases, like over trusting. You see videos of people in the back seat of their autonomous car recording the car driving itself and then getting into accidents because they're making bad decisions. So we have the potential to get to a world where autonomous vehicles can be another class of life-saving automotive technology, where they can actually save a lot of lives because we avoid distracted driving, drunk driving, reckless driving, distracted driving. But in order to do that, we have to reinforce that trust in the middle period, when that technology does not yet exist. We shouldn't pretend like it does. We shouldn't believe blindly that it does. And so we will need to, in this middle period, in this SAE 3 to 5 period, build that trust. And that will require a lot of vehicle manufacturers. It will also require a lot from the government, as Joan said, which it is not prepared to do. And then it requires intelligent consumer behavior, and maybe some consumer education as well.
Thanks very much, Ed. And I'll give closing words to you, Monica, before I wrap things up.
Well, okay, so I have several points. One is, I would say industry needs to have an incentive to change its modus operandi. Modus operandi has been profits and money. So the incentives have to come from a global and a national and a global push for this social technical relationship of really considering the humanity question within the development of AI. Because once we take that perspective, then that can incite wonderful R&D possibilities. The second point I would say, and it goes back to what has been mentioned, is major education for everyone. Really understanding what these systems are, where we are right now, and where we can go in the future. And realizing that where we can go in the future is a collective problem. It's not an just industry or just government or just academic problem. It's everybody has to be part of the conversation. And then the final third point, and it's really returning back to the industry, at the industry level, is there really needs to be a consensus between us and industry. Everybody has their own way of thinking. Everybody has their own style, their own products out there, wants to be the winner, right? And we need to come together and say, okay, let's put on the brakes, pun intended here, and let's really take a moment as an industry to define what criteria we want to use for safety. So that at the national level, and then we can't forget, this hasn't come into the conversation, but we need to realize the global regulatory landscape is a whole nother issue, right? Where we have the United States with its civil liberties and civil rights perspective versus the human rights foundational perspective of the European Commission, the European Union member states, and then we have the authoritarian style from China. So we have these three different modes being thrown around, and yet at the same time, we're creating products that are going to be used across the world. They're not isolated to a single nation. So we need to come to a balanced moment together, as I would say, is the #1 priority.
Well, fantastic way to close. I want to thank all of our panelists for coming on and spending an hour and a half with us today to speak about these issues. I also want to again thank Ryan, the Executive Director for Humanity, Arzu and Sundar for their tremendous work in organizing this conference, and Jonathan for helping us facilitate the conference. Thanks again, everybody, and please stick around for the closing video.
I am Nadine Felber, a Fellow of For Humanity. For Humanity is laying the foundation for an infrastructure of trust with independent audit of AI systems. Independent audit of AI systems can help mitigate risks in AI and autonomous systems. Are you aware of what independent audit of AI systems is? IAAIS is an operational audit framework to provide assurance and mitigate risks from AI and autonomous systems.